When my mother-in-law whispered something in my husband's ear, his face twisted with anger. Without warning, he yanked my hair and landed a hard punch to my face. I collapsed, dazed and terrified. Desperate for help, I called the police. But when they arrived, I was horrified to find that the officer was a friend of my husband. My heart sank as he dismissed my pleas, claiming I had no proof. With my immediate safety compromised and feeling utterly alone, I knew I needed a new plan. And that's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I still remember the first day I brought my daughter, Lily, home from the hospital. The joy was overwhelming, but so was the exhaustion. I'm Isabella, 30 years old, trying to adjust to the whirlwind of motherhood. The first few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and trying to keep up with the chaos that had taken over our home in Austin, Texas. The house was often a mess, with laundry piling up and the kitchen in a constant state of disarray. David, my husband, was working long hours, and I felt like I was barely keeping my head above water. One particularly stressful afternoon, as I struggled to soothe Lily's cries, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I looked around at the untidy residence, feeling a pang of shame. I hadn't had a chance to clean up, and the sight of the dirty kitchen only added to my stress. When I opened the door, there stood Margaret, David's mother. She was a force to be reckoned with, her presence commanding attention the moment she arrived. "Well, look at this," Margaret said, stepping inside with a critical eye. "I see things haven't improved much since the last time I visited." I tried to muster a smile, but it felt strained. "Hi, Margaret. I'm just a bit overwhelmed with everything right now." Margaret's gaze swept over the living room, taking in the scattered toys and the pile of dishes in the kitchen. "Overwhelmed? It looks more like you've given up. Is this really how you plan to raise my granddaughter?" Her words stung, but I tried to stay calm. "I'm doing my best. It's just been a lot to handle." Margaret's disapproval was palpable. She walked into the kitchen and raised an eyebrow at the state of it. "This place is a mess. How can you expect to manage anything if you can't even keep the house clean?" I felt my cheeks flush with humiliation. David's work schedule left me to handle everything on my own, and while I was trying, it was clear it wasn't enough for Margaret. The front door opened, and David walked in, his face lighting up when he saw his mother.
"Mom."
"What a surprise. I didn't know you were coming by." Margaret immediately seized the opportunity. "David, just look at this. Your wife can't even manage to keep the house in order. It's like she's completely lost control." David's face fell as he glanced around, taking in the messy state of our home. "Isabella, we need to talk about this. I know things are tough, but you have to prioritize better." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "David, I'm trying. It's not as easy as it looks." Margaret, ever the instigator, chimed in. "Being a mother is about more than just caring for the baby. It's about responsibility and managing your household." David's gaze shifted between his mother and me, his expression conflicted. "Mom, maybe we should try to help her understand what's at stake here." "Help her understand?" Margaret's voice grew sharper. "She needs to learn discipline. She's not living up to our family standards." The tension in the room was palpable. David, who usually stood by me, was now looking at me with a mixture of frustration and confusion. "Sophie, you need to get your act together. This isn't acceptable." Before I could respond, Margaret stepped closer to David, whispering something in his ear. David's face hardened, and he looked back at me with an unreadable expression. "Maybe you're right," he said reluctantly. "Maybe you need to learn the hard way." I felt my heart drop as David moved toward me. In a shocking burst of anger, he grabbed my hair and yanked it painfully. Before I could react, he threw a hard punch to my face. The force of it sent me reeling, and I staggered back, clutching my cheek as tears streamed down my face. I could barely process what had just happened. The pain was sharp, but the sense of betrayal was even worse. Lily, who had been quiet during the confrontation, began to cry, adding to my overwhelming distress. Desperation set in, and I reached for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. When the police officer arrived, I hoped for some relief. But my heart sank when I realized he was an old friend of David's. His demeanor was calm and dismissive as he listened to my report. "I'm afraid I can't do much without solid evidence," he said, glancing at David. "There's not enough here to act on." I was stunned. The officer, who should have been my ally, was siding with David. "But he hit me. Can't you do anything?" The officer shook his head. "Without clear proof, there's nothing I can do. Maybe next time, try to gather more evidence before calling us." He left, leaving me feeling even more isolated. I looked at David, who had a cold, indifferent look on his face. Margaret stood beside him, her expression one of smug satisfaction. The sense of betrayal from both David and the officer left me feeling utterly alone. As the door closed behind the officer, I sank to the floor, cradling Lily in my arms. The house that was supposed to be my home now felt like a prison. The physical pain from the punch was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. This was the moment when I realized that my life had become something I couldn't tolerate. I knew I needed to make a change, but the road ahead seemed daunting. David's behavior, under Margaret's influence, had crossed a line that could never be undone. I needed to find a way out, not just for myself, but for my daughter as well. In the midst of the chaos and despair, I made a silent vow to myself. I would find a way to escape this nightmare and build a life where Lily and I could be safe and happy. This was only the beginning of a journey that would test my strength and resilience in ways I never imagined. The days that followed the attack were some of the hardest I had ever faced. I was deeply shaken, but the physical and emotional pain from David's violence were overshadowed by a stronger feeling, determination. I knew I had to get out. I had to protect Lily and find a way to escape the toxic environment David and Margaret had created. But how? It wasn't until a few days later that I found a glimmer of hope. Rachel, my old friend from college, had always been someone I could rely on. I reached out to her, hoping she could offer guidance. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to burden her with my problems, but desperation gave me the courage to call. "Rachel, it's Isabella. I need your help," I said, my voice trembling as I spoke into the phone. "Things have gotten really bad. David, he hit me. The police didn't help, and I'm afraid to stay here any longer." Rachel's response was immediate and filled with concern. "Isabella, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I'm an investigator now. I can help you. Let's meet and talk about what you need." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop. When I walked in, Rachel was already there, looking as composed as ever. I sat down across from her, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. "So, what's the plan?" Rachel asked, her eyes steady and focused. I took a deep breath. "I need to leave David, but I can't do it without proof of what's happening. I need to gather evidence to show that his behavior is abusive and that Margaret's control over him is a big part of it." Rachel nodded. "We'll need to document everything. Do you have any recordings, messages, or evidence of the abuse?" I shook my head. "I don't, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Rachel's face softened with sympathy. "We'll start by gathering as much evidence as we can. We'll need to document your interactions with David and Margaret, and if you can, try to record any instances of abuse or manipulation." Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I worked tirelessly. Rachel showed me how to use a hidden recording app on my phone to capture conversations and incidents. I recorded phone calls, text messages, and even began documenting my daily interactions with David and Margaret. I was careful not to draw their suspicion while doing this, which was challenging given how closely they were monitoring me. One day, Margaret called me while David was at work. I answered the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello, Margaret." "Isabella," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "David told me you've been causing trouble. I've been very patient, but it's clear you need to be reminded of your place." I recorded the entire conversation, capturing her manipulative tone and the way she spoke about David and me. It was disturbing to hear her undermine my efforts as a mother and wife, but it was crucial evidence. Rachel and I also planned for my eventual departure. We mapped out a strategy to leave when David was at work, ensuring that he wouldn't be around to stop me. Rachel helped me organize a safe place to stay temporarily, making sure Lily and I would have somewhere secure to go once we left. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The decision to leave was not just about escaping David's physical abuse, but about breaking free from the suffocating control Margaret had over our lives. I knew that this step would be dangerous and challenging, but I had to do it for Lily's sake. The day of our planned departure came, and I felt a knot of fear and excitement in my stomach. David was supposed to be at work, and Rachel had agreed to meet me at the house to help with the move. I spent the morning packing a few essentials, trying to stay calm and focused. As I was about to leave, I received a text from Rachel. "I'm outside. Are you ready?" My heart raced as I quickly gathered Lily and our things. I took one last look at the house that had been both a home and a prison. The clutter, the mess, it all symbolized the chaos and control that had plagued our lives. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the door, locking it behind me. Rachel and I loaded everything into her car and drove to her house. The journey was quiet, but filled with unspoken relief. I knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, but I also knew that there was still a long way to go. The road ahead was uncertain, but I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in a long while. Once we arrived at Rachel's house, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. We unloaded our things and settled in. Rachel offered comfort and support, reminding me that this was just the first step in our plan. In the days that followed, Rachel and I focused on collecting more evidence and preparing for the next phase. We knew that exposing David and Margaret's abuse would be crucial for our case. I was determined to see this through, no matter how challenging it might be. Rachel's support was invaluable, and her expertise as an investigator was a lifeline during this turbulent time. Together, we prepared for the crucial task of building a solid case against David and Margaret, knowing that our efforts were not clear, detailed evidence to present. We also focused on documenting every instance of David's abusive behavior. Rachel advised me to reach out to any family members or friends who might have witnessed Margaret's controlling ways or had seen David's violent tendencies. One of David's cousins, who had always been sympathetic towards me, agreed to speak up. She provided a written statement detailing her observations of David's aggressive behavior and Margaret's interference in our marriage. With the evidence compiled, Rachel and I began to organize our presentation. We knew that simply having evidence wasn't enough. We needed to present it in a way that would be convincing and comprehensive. We categorized the materials into several key areas: abuse incidents, manipulation by Margaret, and David's erratic behavior. Rachel helped me prepare a detailed report, summarizing each piece of evidence and its significance. We included timestamps and context for the recordings, ensuring that everything was as clear and precise as possible. It was a daunting task, but it was necessary to build a strong case. One day, Rachel and I met with a lawyer who specialized in domestic abuse cases. She reviewed our evidence and gave us crucial advice on how to proceed. "You have a solid case," she said, flipping through the documents and listening to the recordings. "But we need to ensure that everything is presented clearly. I'll help you file a restraining order and press charges." Her words were a beacon of hope. Knowing that we had legal support to back us up was incredibly reassuring. We worked with her to prepare the necessary paperwork and ensure that all our evidence was in order. The day of the court hearing arrived, and my nerves were frayed. Rachel and I walked into the courthouse, carrying the weight of our efforts and the hope for justice. The atmosphere was tense, and I could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on me. Rachel stayed by my side, providing support and encouragement as we awaited our turn. When it was finally time to present our case, I felt a surge of adrenaline and fear. The evidence was overwhelming, and Rachel's legal expertise guided us through the process. We played the recordings, presented the documents, and shared the testimonies from David's cousin and other witnesses. The courtroom was quiet as the evidence unfolded. I could see the judge's reaction as he listened to the recordings and reviewed the evidence. It was a nerve-wracking experience, but I knew that this was the culmination of all our hard work. As the hearing concluded, the judge's decision was imminent. Rachel and I waited anxiously for the verdict. It was a tense time, but I was hopeful that the evidence would be enough to secure a positive outcome. The days following the hearing were filled with anticipation. Finally, we received the news we had been waiting for. The judge had ruled in our favor. David and Margaret would face legal consequences for their actions. It was a significant victory, but I knew that there was still much work to be done. Rachel and I continued to work on securing my new apartment and finalizing our plans. The legal victory was just one step in our journey toward rebuilding a safe and independent life. With the support of Rachel and the legal system, I felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. In reflecting on these events, I realized that the fight for justice had been a transformative experience. It had tested my strength, resilience, and resolve. But with each step forward, I grew more confident in my ability to overcome the challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. With the court ruling in our favor, Rachel and I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The evidence we had so painstakingly gathered had paid off, but the final step, seeing David and Margaret held accountable, was still ahead of us. The time had come to involve the authorities and ensure that justice was served. Rachel and I worked closely with our lawyer to coordinate with the police. We compiled a comprehensive dossier of evidence, including recordings, texts, and witness statements, and handed it over to the authorities. Rachel's expertise and my first-hand accounts made our case as robust as possible. On the day of the arrest, my heart raced with a mixture of fear and hope. David and Margaret were still unaware of what was coming, and I was nervous about how they would react. Rachel stayed by my side, providing support and helping me stay focused. The police arrived at David and Margaret's house in the afternoon. I watched from a distance, my emotions a tangled mess of anxiety and anticipation. Rachel had advised me to stay away from the scene for my safety and to avoid any direct confrontation. From what I could see, the officers were taking their time as they approached the house. It was an agonizing wait. Finally, after what felt like hours, Rachel received a call from one of the officers. David and Margaret had been arrested. The weight of the news was almost overwhelming. The long, painful journey to this point had finally reached its climax, and the people who had tormented me were now facing consequences for their actions. That evening, as the sun set over Austin, I felt a profound sense of closure. It wasn't just about the legal victory, it was about reclaiming my life and asserting my right to safety and respect. With David and Margaret facing charges, I could finally start to think about my future without the shadow of their abuse looming over me. In the days that followed, I worked on settling into my new apartment with my daughter. The move was physically and emotionally exhausting, but it also symbolized a new beginning. I took great care in setting up our home to be a peaceful and nurturing environment for my daughter. It was important for me to create a space where we could heal and start anew. Rachel continued to be a steadfast friend and supporter. She helped me navigate the complexities of my new life and ensured that I had access to the resources and support I needed. Her presence was a constant reminder of the strength that had carried me through this ordeal. The legal process continued, and I stayed updated on the proceedings. David and Margaret's court dates were set, and I was prepared to testify if necessary. The legal system would hold them accountable for their abusive behavior, and I was determined to see it through. As I looked back on the journey, I was struck by the incredible support I had received from Rachel and the legal system. Their help had been instrumental in breaking free from the cycle of abuse and beginning a new chapter in my life. It was a reminder of the importance of resilience, courage, and seeking support when facing adversity. The day David and Margaret were officially charged was a bittersweet moment. I felt a sense of justice being served, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the impact of their actions would linger. Nonetheless, the legal consequences they faced were a crucial step in holding them accountable and ensuring that they could no longer inflict harm on anyone else. As I settled into my new life, I reflected on the strength it took to confront and overcome such a deeply painful situation. The support of friends, the legal victories, and my own determination had all played a vital role in helping me rebuild my life. I was now in a place where I could focus on creating a positive and loving environment for my daughter, free from the shadow of abuse and manipulation. In the end, my journey was a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of standing up against abuse. With each day that passed, I felt stronger and more capable of facing the future with hope and confidence.
This story is titled, Mother-in-Law Broke Into My House and Shaved My Hair. Husband defended her, so I walked out. Now they're begging for my help. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. I never thought I'd be the type to air my personal drama online, but this situation is so beyond insane that I can't keep it to myself. My husband, Mark, 33 male, and I, 30 female, have been married for 4 years. And while his mom, Linda, 55 female, has always been a bit extra, I never imagined she'd take her antics to this level. From day one, Linda had her opinions about me, my job, my clothes, even the way I distract her precious son. But last week she took it way too far, and I'm still reeling. Last night, I woke up to a nightmare, and I'm not even exaggerating. You know when you have one of those mornings where something just feels off, but you can't put your finger on it right away? That was me. My head felt lighter, almost like something was missing. Half asleep, I stumbled into the bathroom and turned on the light. And then I saw it. My reflection staring back at me, except it wasn't me. One side of my hair was hacked into a jagged mess, like someone had gone at it with garden shears, while the other side still hung awkwardly past my shoulder. I froze, completely stunned. My brain couldn't even process it at first. Did I do this to myself? Did I sleepwalk and somehow find scissors in the middle of the night? I stood there, poking at my uneven hair in disbelief. It looked so bad it was almost funny. Except it wasn't. After about 10 minutes of staring at myself like an idiot, I started piecing things together. There was no way I did this. I've never sleepwalked a day in my life, and I definitely wouldn't attack my own hair in my sleep. So who the hell did this? The only other person in the house was my husband, Mark. I found him in the kitchen, scrolling on his phone like it was any normal day. I walked in trying to stay calm and said, "Hey, do you know what happened to my hair?" Mark looked up, and the second he saw me, his face went pale. He stammered, what are you talking about?" I pointed to my head, still half expecting him to tell me it was some weird prank, or that I was imagining things, but no. He just stared at me like I had 3 heads, and then he said the weirdest thing. I think my mom might have done it. I swear, I thought I misheard him. "What are you talking about? Your mom? Linda? She doesn't even have a key to our house." Mark avoided eye contact, which is always a dead giveaway that he's hiding something. He started mumbling about how Linda had been acting worried lately and might have come over last night. At that point, I was fully awake and ready to lose it. "Are you telling me your mom snuck into our house in the middle of the night and cut my hair?" Mark shrugged like it wasn't a big deal and said, "I don't know. Maybe? Maybe?" I didn't even know how to respond to that. What kind of person breaks into someone's house with scissors and gives them a surprise haircut while they're sleeping? Linda isn't just nosy or overbearing. This was next level insane. Mark finally admitted that Linda had been making some weird comments lately about me and this coworker of mine, Matt, 25 male. Apparently, she decided that I was cheating on Mark, and in her delusional little mind, cutting my hair was some kind of punishment. At this point, I was shaking with anger. I grabbed my phone and called Linda right away. I didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Linda, did you cut my hair last night?" She paused for a second, probably trying to figure out how to lie her way out of it. But then she said, "Well, maybe now you'll think twice before embarrassing my son." Embarrassing him? Lady, I'm the one walking around looking like a rejected emo teenager. After confronting Linda and hearing her ridiculous excuse, I was more confused and furious than ever. It wasn't just that she'd cut my hair, though that alone was horrific. It was her total lack of remorse. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she had the audacity to act like she was doing everyone a favor. When I told her that Matt and I were just co-workers and that the lunch was nothing but work-related, she immediately dismissed me. "You expect me to believe that?" She scoffed, as if she'd caught me in some elaborate lie. "I wasn't born yesterday, sweetheart. Women like you always think you can fool everyone, but I see right through you." "Women like me?" I repeated, stunned. What does that even mean? Linda didn't answer directly. Instead, she went on this weird rant about how modern women have no respect for marriage, and how men are always the last to know. It was clear she had made up this entire story in her head, and no amount of logic or evidence was going to change her mind. I tried to explain myself calmly at first, even though I was shaking with rage. "Linda, you're completely wrong. Matt is just a coworker. We were discussing a project at work. Mark knows I have to meet with coworkers sometimes. It's part of my job." "That's what they all say. I know the signs, and you've been giving off plenty of them," she said. At that point, I lost it. The signs? Linda, you don't even live with us. You see me once a week, if that. What signs are you talking about? She had no real answer, of course. She just kept spewing nonsense about how she was protecting her son and how I should be grateful she didn't do something worse. Grateful? Grateful for what? For violating my privacy? For sneaking into my house like a criminal? For humiliating me? It was so absurd that I almost laughed. Almost. When I hung up the phone, I felt like I'd just argued with a brick wall. I turned to Mark, hoping for some kind of support, but he looked like he wanted to disappear. Well, I said, crossing my arms, what are you going to do about this? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. She's my mom. She's just worried about me. Worried about you? I shot back. She's delusional, Mark. She broke into our house and cut my hair because she thinks I'm cheating on you. How is that okay in any universe? Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he started pacing around the kitchen, mumbling excuses for Linda. She's old-fashioned. She's protective. She's always been like this. I don't care what she's like, I snapped. What she did was crazy and illegal and humiliating. You need to stand up to her and tell her this is unacceptable. Mark nodded vaguely, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. He's always had a hard time standing up to Linda, and I knew this situation was no different. It's like she has some kind of power over him, a way of making him feel like a little kid again, even though he's a grown man. That night, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. Linda's words kept echoing. Women like you always think they can fool everyone. What the hell was that supposed to mean? I'd been nothing but faithful to Mark since the day we met. I've always taken my marriage seriously, even when Linda tried to insert herself into every little decision we made. And now she was trying to tear us apart with some made-up story about me cheating. I felt so violated, not just by Linda, but by Mark, too. His refusal to stand up for me felt like a betrayal in itself. I couldn't understand how he could just shrug this off like it was no big deal. I went to bed that night with a knot in my stomach, knowing that this wasn't over. Linda might have been the one holding the scissors, but Mark's lack of support cut just as deep. The next morning, I decided to lay down some ground rules. I sat Mark down at the kitchen table and said, "We need to talk about your mom. What she did was completely out of line, and I'm not going to let her get away with it." Mark looked uncomfortable, but he nodded. "Okay, what do you want to do?" "For starters, I want her out of our lives," I said firmly. "She can't come over here anymore. Not until she apologizes and gets help." "Help?" Mark asked, frowning. "Yes, help," I said. "She broke into our house and cut my hair, Mark. That's not normal. She needs therapy or something." Mark shifted in his seat, looking torn. "I don't know. She's my mom. I can't just cut her out like that." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger in check. "I'm not asking you to cut her out forever, but she needs consequences. If we just let this slide, she'll think it's okay to keep crossing boundaries." Mark didn't argue, but he didn't exactly agree either. He just mumbled something about needing time to think. Meanwhile, Linda kept calling and texting me, acting like she was the victim in all this. She accused me of being selfish for not forgiving her. One text even said, "If you really loved Mark, you'd understand why I did what I did." I couldn't believe the nerve of this woman. She genuinely thought she was in the right, that her actions were justified because she was protecting her son. It was like she was living in some alternate reality, where she got to decide who I was and what my intentions were. By the end of the week, I was at my breaking point. Between Mark's indecisiveness and Linda's nonstop harassment, I felt like I was going crazy. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and every time I looked in the mirror, I was reminded of what she'd done to me. Something had to give. I told Mark that if he couldn't stand up to his mom, I would. "She's not welcome in this house," I said firmly, "and if you can't tell her that, I will." Mark looked panicked, like I just asked him to climb Mount Everest. "Can we at least wait a few days?" he pleaded. "No," I said. "This has gone on long enough. Either you talk to her, or I do." He finally agreed to confront Linda with me, but I could tell he wasn't happy about it. Part of me wondered if he was really on my side, or if he was just trying to keep the peace. Either way, I knew this wasn't over. Linda wasn't just a meddling mother-in-law. She was a full-blown menace. And if Mark couldn't see that, I didn't know how much longer I could stay in this marriage. By the time Mark and I sat down to confront Linda together, I was already on edge. I'd been dealing with her constant calls and texts for days, each one more manipulative than the last. She didn't apologize, or even acknowledge that what she did was wrong. Instead, she doubled down, acting like I was the bad guy for being upset. And Mark? He was dragging his feet the entire time, trying to avoid the confrontation altogether. When we finally got to Linda's house, she greeted us with this smug, self-satisfied look on her face. "Well, it's about time," she said, standing in the doorway like she was the queen of the world. Mark hesitated, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. I nudged him forward, whispering, "You need to say something." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened." Linda's expression didn't change. She crossed her arms and said, "What is there to talk about?" I did what needed to be done. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Needed to be done?" I said, stepping forward. "You broke into our house and cut my hair while I was asleep. Do you even understand how insane that sounds?" Linda rolled her eyes. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. It's just hair. It'll grow back." "That was it," I snapped. "It's not just about the hair, Linda. It's about the fact that you invaded my personal space, disrespected me, and violated my trust. And for what? Because you think I'm cheating on Mark? Based on absolutely nothing?" She didn't even flinch. "I saw you with that man," she said, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. "I know what I saw." I turned to Mark, waiting for him to back me up. This was his chance to finally stand up for me, to show that he believed me and not his mother. But instead, he just stood there, staring at the floor like a scolded child. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling, "are you seriously going to let her talk to me like this? Say something." He finally looked up, and what he said next completely shattered me. "I don't know, okay? I don't know what to believe anymore." It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. "You don't know what to believe?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, Mom's been saying things, and I've been noticing stuff too. Like how you've been on your phone more lately, and you've been working late a lot." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You think I'm cheating on you?" "I don't know," he snapped, throwing his hands in the air. But I couldn't ignore it either. And when Mom said she was going to do what she did, I didn't stop her because I thought maybe it would, I don't know, bring out the truth. At that moment, it felt like my entire world had come crashing down. Not only had Linda violated me in the most personal way possible, but now I was finding out that Mark, my husband, the person who was supposed to love and trust me, had been in on it. He let this happen because he believed his mom's paranoid delusions over me. I took a deep breath, trying to keep myself from completely losing it. "So, let me get this straight," I said, my voice shaking. "You thought I was cheating on you, and instead of talking to me like an adult, you let your mom sneak into our house and assault me in my sleep? That's how little you trust me?" Mark looked at me, guilt written all over his face, but he didn't say anything. That silence told me everything I needed to know. Meanwhile, Linda was sitting there with a satisfied smirk, like she'd just won some twisted game. "See?" she said, addressing Mark. "I told you she wasn't innocent. Look at how defensive she's being." I turned to her, shaking with anger. "I'm defensive because you're accusing me of something I didn't do. I've never cheated on Mark, and I never would. Matt is just a co-worker, but even if he wasn't, that still wouldn't justify what you did. You're not the morality police, Linda. You're a bully." Her face darkened, and for a moment, she looked like she was going to argue. But then she just shrugged and said, "Believe what you want. I did what I had to do for my son. I couldn't stay in that house a second longer." I turned to Mark and said, "I'm done. If you can't see how insane this is, then I can't be with you." "What are you saying?" he asked, panic flashing in his eyes. "I'm saying I'm leaving," I said firmly. "You and your mom can have each other. I'm done trying to prove myself to either of you." I went home, packed a bag, and left to stay with my friend Chloe, 30 female. The whole drive there, I kept replaying everything in my head. The way Linda had smirked, the way Mark had hesitated, the way they had both made me feel like a liar and a villain. When I got to Chloe's, I broke down completely. She hugged me while I sobbed, telling her the whole story between gasps for air. "How could he believe her over me?" I asked, my voice raw. "I've done nothing but love him, and this is how he repays me?" Chloe shook her head, looking just as furious as I felt. "This isn't about you, hun. It's about them. Linda's crazy, and Mark's too weak to stand up to her. You deserve better than this." Hearing her say that stung, but it also felt like the truth. Mark had always struggled to set boundaries with Linda. She'd meddled in everything from our wedding planning to how we decorated our home. She had opinions on everything: how I dressed, how I cooked, even how I talked to Mark. I'd chalked it up to overprotectiveness, but now I realized it was so much more than that. She was right, of course, but that didn't make it hurt any less. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and completely alone. The person I thought I could trust more than anyone else in the world had let me down in the worst possible way. Over the next few days, I barely slept or ate. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about how easily Mark had thrown our relationship under the bus because of his mom's manipulative lies. It wasn't just the haircut. It was the lack of trust, the lack of respect, the lack of everything that makes a marriage work. And the worst part? Mark wasn't even trying to fix it. Sure, he sent a few texts apologizing and saying he wanted to talk, but it all felt hollow. If he really wanted to make things right, he wouldn't be hiding behind his phone. He'd be here, fighting for me. But he wasn't. And that told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, I woke up to a flurry of missed calls and texts from Mark. At first, I thought maybe he'd finally grown a spine and was ready to take responsibility. But no, the texts were the same as always. Can we please talk? I know you're mad, but we can work this out. I'm really sorry. I just didn't know what to do. What was there to talk about? What was left to work out? He'd shown me who he was. Someone who would always put his mother's feelings above mine, no matter how much it hurt me. Then there were Linda's messages. I hadn't blocked her yet, though I probably should have. She'd been sending these long, ranting voicemails about how I was tearing the family apart and how I needed to come home and be a good wife. She even said, "Mark is miserable without you. If you really cared about him, you'd stop being so selfish and forgive us." Selfish? Linda really thought I was the selfish one in all of this? I played one of her voicemails for Chloe, who immediately snatched my phone out of my hand and deleted it. "Why are you even listening to her?" she asked, her voice sharp. "She's crazy, and you don't owe her anything." She was right, of course, but it was hard to ignore the guilt gnawing at me. I wasn't the one who'd done anything wrong, but Linda had a way of twisting things, making me feel like I was the problem. Over the next few days, I started thinking more seriously about what I wanted. Did I really want to stay in a marriage where my husband didn't trust me? Where his mother had so much control over his thoughts and actions? The answer was becoming painfully clear. But leaving wasn't as simple as just walking away. Mark and I had a life together, a shared bank account, a lease, furniture we'd picked out together. And part of me still loved him, even though I hated what he'd done. It felt like a betrayal of my own heart to admit that our relationship was broken beyond repair. Chloe, ever the practical one, sat me down and helped me make a list. "Okay," she said, tapping a pen against her notebook. "If you're serious about leaving, you need a plan. First, where are you going to live?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I can't stay here forever." "Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you need," she said. "But eventually, you'll need your own space. Do you have any savings?" "Some," I said, "but most of it's tied up in our joint account." "Then step one is to open a new account," she said firmly. "Transfer whatever's yours before Mark can touch it. You don't want to be left with nothing if things get messy." She was right, of course, but the thought of taking those steps, of making this real, was terrifying. Still, I knew I couldn't stay stuck in limbo forever. Later that day, I sat down with my laptop and started looking up divorce lawyers. Just typing the word divorce into the search bar made my chest tighten. This wasn't what I'd wanted for my life. I'd married Mark because I thought he was the one, because I believed we could build a future together. Now, that future felt like a cruel joke. I found a few local lawyers and sent out some inquiries, explaining my situation as best I could without breaking down. One of them called me back almost immediately, and we set up a consultation for the next day. That night, I lay awake in Chloe's guest room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything I'd lost. My trust in Mark, my sense of security, even my hair. It all felt like it had been ripped away from me in an instant. But beneath the sadness, there was a growing sense of determination. I deserved better than this. Better than Mark's spinelessness. Better than Linda's manipulation. Better than a life where I constantly had to prove my worth to people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The consultation with the lawyer was a turning point. She listened patiently as I explained what had happened, taking notes and asking questions when necessary. When I was finished, she looked at me and said, "You have every right to be angry. What your mother-in-law did wasn't just invasive, it was criminal. And your husband's complicity makes it even worse." Hearing someone else validate my feelings was a relief I hadn't realized I needed. The lawyer explained my options. I could file for divorce, press charges against Linda, or both. She assured me that I didn't have to decide everything right away, but I needed to start protecting myself, financially, legally, and emotionally. By the time I left her office, I felt more in control than I had in weeks. For the first time, I had a plan. A way to take back some of the power that Linda and Mark had stolen from me. Over the next few days, I started putting the plan into action. I opened a new bank account and transferred my portion of our savings. I changed the passwords on all my accounts and made sure Linda didn't have access to any of my personal information. I also blocked Linda's number. I didn't need to hear any more of her rants or guilt trips. As far as I was concerned, she was out of my life for good. Mark, however, was harder to cut off. He kept texting and calling, begging me to come home. One night, he even showed up at Chloe's door looking like a wreck. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Just come back." But I couldn't, not after everything that had happened. "I don't think there's anything left to fix," I told him, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. He left after that, and I haven't heard from him since. Breaking point reached, I knew this was the end of my marriage. It hurt like hell, but it also felt like a weight had been lifted. For the first time in years, I wasn't living under Linda's shadow or bending over backward to make Mark happy. This was the start of something new, something better. After the confrontation with Linda and my decision to leave Mark, I knew I couldn't just walk away without holding them accountable. The haircut was a symbol of something far deeper, the utter disregard for my boundaries, my trust, and my dignity. It wasn't just Linda's crime, it was Mark's complicity that hurt the most. I realized I needed to take action, not just for myself, but to ensure neither of them would ever think this behavior was acceptable again. Pressing charges against Linda seemed like the obvious next step, but the idea of involving the police made me uneasy. What if it just makes everything messier? I asked Chloe as we sat at her kitchen table, a pile of papers spread out in front of us. Chloe shook her head. Messier than what? She broke into your house and assaulted you in your sleep. That's not something you just let slide. If you don't do something, she'll think she can get away with it, and who knows what she'll try next. She had a point. Linda had already shown she wasn't afraid to cross boundaries. If I let this go, what would stop her from coming after me again? The next morning, I gathered everything I had as evidence. I took photos of my hair, the hacked-up mess she'd left me with, and the texts and voicemails she'd sent me afterward. I wrote out a detailed timeline of events, starting with the lunch I'd had with Matt that had apparently sparked her delusional accusations. I also decided to press record every time Linda called. Even though I'd blocked her on my phone, she'd found other ways to contact me, including calling from unknown numbers. One of the messages she left was particularly chilling. You can run all you want, but you'll always be my son's wife. You owe it to him to come back and fix this. Owe it to him? The only thing I owed anyone was justice. For myself. With everything documented, I made an appointment with a police officer who handled domestic disputes. Walking into the station was nerve-wracking. I felt like I was about to be judged for bringing something as trivial as a haircut to the authorities. But the officer I spoke with was professional and kind. As I explained what had happened, he didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, he nodded, taking detailed notes. When I finished, the officer leaned forward and said, "You're absolutely right to report this. What your mother-in-law did is considered assault, and the fact that she entered your home without permission makes it even more serious. We'll file a report and take it from there." For so long, I'd felt like I was overreacting or being dramatic, but now I had someone on my side who understood the gravity of what had happened. After filing the police report, I turned my attention back to Mark. I'd already told him our marriage was over, but now I needed to make it official. I called my lawyer and began the process of filing for divorce. The lawyer was incredibly supportive, walking me through each step and explaining what to expect. "Given the circumstances," she said, "I think you have a strong case for a restraining order against your mother-in-law. And as for your husband, we'll make sure the division of assets is fair. Do you think he'll contest the divorce?" I thought about it for a moment. Mark wasn't a bad person at his core, but he was weak, and he'd always let Linda call the shots. I couldn't imagine him putting up much of a fight. "I don't think so," I said. "He'll probably just go along with whatever Linda tells him to do." The lawyer nodded. "We'll be prepared either way." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, therapy sessions, and long conversations with Chloe. I also began looking for a new place to live. Staying with Chloe had been a lifesaver, but I didn't want to overstay my welcome. Plus, I knew I needed a space of my own, a fresh start where I could heal and rebuild without the constant reminders of what had happened. Throughout this time, Linda continued to loom in the background like a dark cloud. She hadn't been arrested yet, but the police assured me that they were investigating my case and that charges would likely be filed soon. Knowing that she might finally face consequences gave me a sense of closure. Sure enough, a week later, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered it, and of course, it was Linda. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she hissed. "Running to the police, tearing apart your marriage, ruining my son's life. You're nothing but a coward." I hung up without saying a word. After that, I changed my phone number and gave the new one only to a handful of trusted friends and family members. I also let the police know about the call, adding it to the growing list of evidence against Linda. By the time Linda was officially charged with assault and breaking and entering, I felt a sense of justice I hadn't thought possible. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it sent a clear message. I wasn't going to let her or anyone else walk all over me ever again. As for Mark, he eventually reached out through my lawyer, asking for one final conversation. I declined. There was nothing left to say. I wasn't the same person I'd been when I married him, and honestly, that was a good thing. One of the first things I did after moving into my new apartment was cut off all remaining ties to Linda and Mark. Legally, things were still in progress. The divorce paperwork was being finalized, and Linda's charges were moving through the system. But emotionally, I was ready to let them go. I blocked Mark on every platform, even though he hadn't reached out since our last communication through the lawyer. Part of me wondered if he'd given up, or if Linda was still pulling his strings behind the scenes. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. Now, Linda's facing legal charges, and Mark, he's exactly where he wants to be, wrapped in her apron strings. It's a weird kind of freedom to let go of people who never really had your back. I might not have my long hair anymore, but at least I've got my dignity, and that's something Linda or Mark could never take from me.
I was 9 months pregnant, stranded alone on a dark road, and desperately calling for help. My cruel husband and mother-in-law had just left me there, shouting that my problems were my own. Fear gripped me as I waited in the cold night, but nobody knew what was going to happen in the next few hours. My name is Ava, and I'm in my early 30s, living in the suburbs of Houston, Texas. Right now, I'm 9 months pregnant with my first child, and let me tell you, it's been quite a journey. But I want to start at the beginning, before everything changed. I've been married to Greg for 5 years. At first, I thought we had a solid relationship, but as time went on, I realized how much it lacked warmth and respect. Greg is a mid-level manager, always busy with work, and he spends most weekends at his parents' home. It felt like he was prioritizing them over our family. I often found myself alone, managing everything by myself, especially now that I was pregnant. As a freelance graphic designer, I worked from home. It was a dream job, really. I loved expressing my creativity through designs and helping clients bring their visions to life. But in this stage of my life, balancing work and household chores became a juggling act. I was careful about lifting heavy items, and I often relied on my friends for errands like grocery shopping. They were my lifeline during this time, reminding me that I wasn't alone, even when Greg was hardly around. One evening, after a long day of working on a design project, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Greg walked in. His face was set in a scowl, and I could sense trouble brewing. He dropped his briefcase on the floor and pointed towards the fridge. "Did you get the beer?" he demanded, his voice sharp. I blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, Greg. I was busy working, and..." "Busy with what? You've got all the time in the world." He cut me off, annoyance radiating from him. "Just because you're pregnant doesn't mean you can slack off." I felt my heart sink. I was exhausted, and the last thing I needed was an argument. "I'll go to the store now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Reluctantly, I grabbed my keys and headed to the convenience store. On the way, I tried to push Greg's harsh words out of my mind. As I entered the store, I bumped into my neighbor, Jessica, who was in her late 30s. She had a warm smile that instantly lifted my spirits. "Hey, Ava. You look like you could use a friend," she said, her eyes sparkling with kindness. "I'm just running a quick errand for Greg," I replied, forcing a smile. "You're a saint for putting up with him." "I can't imagine how tough it must be right now," she said, gently touching my arm. "You're almost there, though. Just a little longer." We chatted for a bit, and I left the store feeling slightly better. But as soon as I got home, the weight of Greg's earlier anger came crashing down again. "Why did you take so long?" he snapped as I walked through the door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "I had to wait in line," I explained, trying to keep my voice calm. "Whatever," he grumbled, snatching the beer from my hand. "You could have called or something. You know, it's hard for me to keep everything together when you don't do your part." I felt my heart racing as he continued to berate me. I wanted to shout back, to defend myself, but instead, I just stood there, silent and hurt. This was becoming a pattern, him lashing out and me taking the blows without a word. The next day, I woke up hoping things would be better, but it was as if Greg had forgotten about the argument altogether. When he left for work, he mentioned, "Don't bother making dinner tonight. I won't be home." But just a few hours later, he returned unexpectedly, his mood dark again. "Where's dinner?" he barked as he walked in, his eyes narrowing at me. "I thought you weren't coming home," I said, my voice trembling. "Of course I come home. You should have anticipated that," he shouted, his frustration boiling over. "You never think ahead. You need to do better." My heart felt heavy in my chest as he continued. "Maybe if you took some notes from my mother, I wouldn't have to remind you of your responsibilities. She's a real wife." Martha, I thought, cringing at the mention of his mother. She had never liked me. always finding fault in everything I did. Ever since our wedding, she had blamed me for any issues that arose with Greg, believing I wasn't fulfilling my duties as a wife. I could feel the tears welling up, but I fought them back. "Greg, please," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm doing my best." But he was already storming out of the house, heading to his parents' place, leaving me feeling isolated and hurt. Each argument chipped away at me, leaving a scar that felt deeper every time. As the days passed, I could feel the tension between us growing. Greg insisted that I join him on a family trip with his parents, despite my due date looming closer. I was hesitant, but he didn't give me much choice. On the day of the trip, I felt a mix of anxiety and dread. As I sat in the car, taking deep breaths to calm myself, something shifted inside me. I felt a sudden warmth and then panic. My water broke. "Greg," I cried, looking at him in disbelief. "My water just broke." He glanced at me, his expression hardening. "We can't ruin this trip. Get out of the car, Ava. You're ruining everything."
What?
"No. I need to go to the hospital," I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. "Just go by yourself. We can't have this mess in the car." Martha chimed in, her voice cold and unyielding. They both ordered me to leave, as if I were a nuisance, an inconvenience in their perfect plans. Left there, alone and terrified, I felt the weight of their cruelty crashing down on me. In that moment, I realized I was truly on my own. As I sat in the car, my heart raced, and panic washed over me. I couldn't believe what was happening. My water had broken, and instead of support, I faced anger and dismissal from Greg and Martha. "I'm not going anywhere," I yelled, feeling the urgency of the moment. "I need to get to the hospital." But Greg just stared at me, his expression hard and unyielding. "We're not taking you. You'll ruin our trip," he said flatly, and with that, he and his mother turned away, leaving me in disbelief. Desperation clawed at my throat as I watched them, my emotions a chaotic swirl of fear and anger. It was as if I was invisible to them, a mere inconvenience in their lives. I scrambled to find my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Jessica's number. She had always been there for me, and I hoped she would come through again. "Jessica, please. My water just broke, and I need help. Greg and his mother won't take me to the hospital." My voice trembled, and I could hear the urgency in my own words. "Stay right there, Ava. I'm on my way," she replied, her tone steady and reassuring. I hung up and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It felt like an eternity, but soon I saw Jessica's car pull into the driveway. She rushed out, her face a mixture of concern and determination. "I'm here. Let's get you to the hospital," she said, helping me out of the car and guiding me carefully to her vehicle. As we drove, I felt the reality of the situation crashing over me. The pain was beginning to set in, and with each contraction, I gripped the seat, trying to breathe through the waves of discomfort. Jessica kept glancing at me, concern etched on her face. "You're doing great, Ava. Just focus on breathing," she encouraged, her voice calming. When we finally arrived at the hospital, a flurry of nurses rushed to my side. They took charge, wheeling me into the delivery room, and I was grateful for their efficiency. Jessica stayed close, holding my hand as I prepared to bring my baby into the world. "Everything is going to be okay," she whispered, her presence a lifeline in that moment of chaos. As the contractions intensified, I felt a surge of fear mixed with excitement. I was about to become a mother, but the uncertainty of what awaited me afterward loomed large. After hours of labor, I finally heard the sweet sound of my baby crying. Relief washed over me as the nurse handed my child to me. Tears streamed down my face as I looked into the tiny face of my newborn. "You're here," I whispered, my heart swelling with love. Jessica took a step back, giving me a moment to bond with my baby. She smiled, her eyes shining with joy for me. "You did it, Ava. You're a mom," she exclaimed, and I could feel the warmth of her support wrapping around me. Once I was settled in my hospital room, Jessica contacted my parents. They arrived shortly, worry etched on their faces. "How are you, sweetheart?" my mother asked, enveloping me in a warm hug. I'm okay now. Just glad it's over, I replied, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and elation. But as I held my baby, I couldn't shake the feeling of anger and betrayal that coursed through me. Greg had abandoned me when I needed him most. How could he choose a trip over his wife and child? I felt a burning desire for justice, for something to change. After a couple of days in the hospital, I was finally discharged. As I prepared to leave, I felt a wave of determination wash over me. I was done being the passive victim in my own life. I needed to reclaim my power. Jessica visited me at home, bringing along a gift for the baby, a soft blanket and a small stuffed animal. I know things have been rough, but you're stronger than you think, Ava, she said, her eyes serious. You deserve happiness, and I'll help you however I can. I looked at her, grateful for her unwavering support. Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate everything, I said, feeling a flicker of hope ignite within me. As the days turned into weeks, I began to plot my next steps. I reached out to a lawyer to discuss my options regarding divorce. The thought of facing Greg again made my stomach churn, but I knew I had to do it. I was ready to fight for my independence, to reclaim my life and ensure my child had a better future. One evening, I sat down with Jessica, and we began to discuss a plan. I want to make sure Greg faces the consequences for what he did, I confessed, my voice steady. Jessica nodded. We'll make sure he doesn't get away with it, Ava. You're not alone in this. In that moment, I realized that I had the strength to move forward, to seek the justice I deserved. I was ready to take control of my life, no matter the challenges ahead. With each passing day, I felt more determined to take back my life. The anger and pain from Greg's betrayal fueled my resolve to seek justice. I sat down with Jessica and my lawyer, Rebecca, to discuss my options. It was time to file for divorce and ensure Greg faced the consequences for how he treated me. Rebecca laid out the steps clearly. Ava, we will start by filing the necessary paperwork. Given the circumstances, especially the way Greg abandoned you during your pregnancy, you have a strong case for custody of your child, she explained, her tone professional yet empathetic. I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and empowerment. I just want what's best for my baby. I don't want Greg in our lives, if he's going to treat us like that. Jessica chimed in. You deserve to be happy, Ava. You've already shown so much strength. We'll be with you every step of the way. Her support meant everything to me. I wasn't alone in this fight. As we moved forward, I couldn't shake the anxiety that crept in every time I thought about facing Greg again. What would he say? Would he try to manipulate me again? I steeled myself for the confrontation, knowing it was necessary for my future. A few days later, I received a call from Rebecca informing me that the court date had been set. My stomach twisted in knots as the date approached. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in a simple but professional outfit, determined to present myself with dignity. As I looked in the mirror, I took a deep breath. I had to stay strong for my baby. Jessica drove me to the courthouse, her presence a comforting balm. You've got this, Ava. Just remember to speak from your heart, she encouraged. When we arrived, I was met with a sense of foreboding. The courthouse felt cold and unwelcoming. I could see Greg sitting in the waiting area, his expression unreadable. He looked up as I entered, and a chill ran down my spine. I quickly averted my gaze, focusing on the path ahead. The hearing began, and I felt the tension in the room. As Rebecca presented my case, I could see Greg's face contort with anger. He tried to counter every point, but I felt a surge of confidence. I was not the helpless woman he had treated me as. Your Honor, I finally spoke, my voice steady but emotional. I just want to provide a safe and loving environment for my child. Greg's behavior during my pregnancy showed that he is not prepared to be a supportive father. Greg shot me a glare, but I didn't waver. This was my moment to reclaim my power. As the judge deliberated, I could feel the weight of my decision pressing down on me. Would they see the truth? Would I get the chance to build a better life for my child? Finally, the judge returned. Based on the evidence presented and the circumstances surrounding this case, I grant Ava full custody of the child. My heart soared, and tears of relief filled my eyes. Greg's face twisted in anger as he realized what had happened. "You can't do this," he shouted, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "You will have scheduled visitation rights, but it will be supervised for the time being," the judge replied firmly. As we left the courthouse, I felt lighter. It was just the beginning, but I knew I had taken the first crucial step toward freedom. I looked at Jessica, who beamed with pride. "You did it, Ava. You stood up for yourself." "Thank you for being here," I said, my voice filled with gratitude. This was a turning point for me. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. With each step forward, I felt stronger and more empowered to face whatever came next. After the court hearing, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I also knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. With full custody granted, my focus shifted to creating a safe and loving home for my baby. I was determined to be the mother my child deserved, one who would provide unconditional love and support. As the weeks went by, I slowly settled into my new routine as a single mother. I named my baby Mia, a name that felt as beautiful and strong as I hoped she would grow to be. Every coo and smile from her filled my heart with joy and purpose. Jessica was always there, supporting me as I navigated the challenges of motherhood. She became a part of our little family, and her son, Max, often visited, bringing laughter and warmth to our home. Despite the happiness, I couldn't shake the lingering shadow of Greg. He had been served divorce papers, and I knew he was furious. His temper had always scared me, and the idea of him trying to interfere in our lives was unsettling. I prepared myself for the inevitable confrontation, reminding myself that I had the strength to face whatever came my way. One evening, as I was putting Mia to bed, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was an unknown number, but my gut told me it was Greg. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Finally, I answered, steeling myself for his words. "Ava," he said, his voice laced with anger. "You think you can just take my daughter away from me? This isn't over." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Greg, this is about Mia's well-being. You need to understand that your behavior has consequences. You have to prove that you can be a responsible father. You'll regret this." "I will fight you every step of the way," he snapped. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Greg," I replied, feeling empowered by my own words. "I won't let you bully me into submission. This is my life and Mia's. You need to respect that." After hanging up, I felt a mix of fear and strength. I realized that I was finally standing up for myself. I didn't have to let Greg's threats control me. With each passing day, I grew more confident in my ability to protect my daughter. Meanwhile, the story of my struggles gained traction online. One of Jessica's influential friends shared my experience, drawing attention to the realities of emotional abuse and the strength it takes to break free. The support from the community flooded in, and I was surprised by the number of people who reached out, sharing their own stories of resilience. Months passed, and Greg continued to attempt to assert his presence in Mia's life, but each time, he faced the legal boundaries I had established. The supervised visits kept him in check, and I made sure to document everything. With Jessica's help, I felt ready for anything he might throw my way. One day, I received a letter from Greg's attorney, indicating he wanted to negotiate a more favorable arrangement regarding visitation. I braced myself for another round of conflict, but I was prepared. I had built a support system, and I knew I wasn't alone. The moment I stepped into the meeting room with my lawyer, I felt a wave of strength wash over me. "I'm ready for this," I thought, glancing at Jessica, who gave me an encouraging nod. In that moment, I understood that my journey was more than just about seeking justice. It was about reclaiming my life and my power. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances. I was Ava, a mother, a survivor, and a woman determined to forge a brighter future for my daughter. As I walked out of that meeting, I felt an overwhelming sense of hope. I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that my past would not define me. I had risen from the ashes of my struggles, and I was finally in control of my own story.
This story is titled, "I overheard my brother-in-law and his fiancée plotting to humiliate me at my wedding, so I turned the tables and ruined their big day instead." All right, let me start with a little background because you need to understand just how much James's brother, Brad, has been a pain in the neck for as long as I've known him. I'm Kelly, 24, and I'm married, recently got married, to James, who's 25. We've been together since high school, and James is honestly the best thing that's ever happened to me. He's kind, hardworking, and just an overall amazing guy. But his brother, Brad? Let's just say the guy is the human equivalent of a thorn stuck in your shoe. Annoying, painful, and impossible to ignore. Brad is 27, and for as long as James can remember, he's always been the golden child in the eyes of their parents. You know the type. He's the older sibling who gets away with everything. Growing up, James told me that Brad was the kind of kid who would break something, blame it on James, and somehow get away with it every time. Boys will be boys, their mom would say. It wasn't just little things either. Brad would actively go out of his way to make James's life miserable. If James got a new toy for his birthday, Brad would take it and break it. If James made a new friend, Brad would swoop in, charm them, and make James feel like the outsider. As they got older, it didn't get any better. Brad would pick on James in front of his friends, calling him things like mama's boy or softy, because James wasn't into the whole macho brooding persona Brad had going on. James, being the good guy he is, tried to brush it off, but I could tell it bothered him. Who wouldn't be hurt when your own brother treats you like crap? Now, Brad's life is, well, it's a mess. He hops from one dead-end job to another because he can't hold down a position for more than a few months. He's the kind of guy who walks into work late and acts surprised when he gets called out for it. He has this cocky attitude, like he's too good for rules or responsibilities, but somehow their parents still make excuses for him. Brad's just figuring things out, they'll say, as if being an inconsiderate jerk is a phase he'll eventually grow out of. When it comes to relationships, Brad's track record is even worse. He's had more girlfriends than I can count, and every single one of them left him for good reason. Brad has this ability to charm women at first. He's got the looks, the smooth talk, and that fake confidence that draws people in. But once they're hooked, he shows his true colors. He's controlling, manipulative, and an expert at gaslighting. All right, so let me tell you about the moment Stephanie entered the picture about 6 months ago. Because trust me, it was a game changer. Before her, Brad's girlfriends were like revolving doors. Here one day, gone the next. It was almost like a running joke in James's family. Every holiday or family event, Brad would show up with someone new, introduce them like they were the love of his life, and then a couple of months later, it was like they never existed. But Stephanie? Oh, she was different. Not in a good way, though. From the moment Brad introduced her at a family BBQ, it was clear this wasn't your average short-term fling. She had this air about her, like she thought she was better than everyone else in the room. And the way she looked at people, it wasn't curiosity or friendliness, it was pure judgment, like she was scanning the crowd for someone to pick apart. The first thing Stephanie said to me wasn't even a greeting. She walked up to where I was standing with James and said, "Oh, you're Kelly? I thought you'd be taller." I was so thrown off that I just laughed awkwardly, but James immediately went into protective mode. He gave her a look and said, "She's perfect the way she is." Stephanie just smirked and muttered, "I was just saying." That set the tone for how she interacted with everyone. She had this way of making snide comments that sounded like compliments if you weren't paying attention. Like when she told James's mom, "You must have been stunning when you were younger. Brad always says you were the prettiest woman in town." Or when she asked James's dad if he was finally going to retire and enjoy life, knowing full well he'd just been laid off. The worst part? Brad ate it up. He stood by her side, grinning like she was the most brilliant, charming woman in the world. For the first time, he seemed genuinely proud of the woman he was with, which made sense because they were basically the same person. They both loved stirring the pot and making themselves the center of attention. Stephanie wasn't just a mean girl, though. She was calculated. You could tell she studied people, figured out their insecurities, and then used them to her advantage. Over the next few months, every time we saw her, she managed to create drama without ever being directly involved. She'd plant little seeds of doubt or gossip, then sit back and watch the chaos unfold. One time, during a family dinner, she casually mentioned how James must have been such a mama's boy growing up, because he was so kind and sensitive. She said it like it was a compliment, but Brad jumped on it, laughing and saying, "Oh, you don't even know the half of it. He used to cry if mom didn't cut the crusts off his sandwiches." The whole table laughed, but I could see James was uncomfortable. Stephanie just smiled sweetly, like she had no idea she'd started it. She also had a habit of trying to one-up people. If someone mentioned a new job or accomplishment, Stephanie would find a way to make it about her or Brad. Like when James told the family he'd gotten a promotion at work. Everyone was genuinely happy for him, except Stephanie. She immediately turned to Brad and said, "Didn't you almost get promoted last year, babe? You totally should have if your boss wasn't such an idiot." It was like she couldn't stand the idea of anyone else getting attention. What really sealed my opinion of Stephanie, though, was when she started hanging out with James's mom more. At first, it seemed innocent. She'd join her for lunch or shopping trips, and I thought maybe she was just trying to get closer to the family. But then James's mom started acting different. She'd make these little comments about how James should call more often, or how it was so nice that Brad always stayed in touch, which was a total lie. Brad only called when he needed something. I later found out from James's sister Emma that Stephanie had been subtly comparing the two brothers during her hangouts with their mom. She'd say things like, "It's so sweet how Brad always talks about how much he loves you," or "Brad was just saying how he wants to make sure you're taken care of when you get older." All lies, of course, but it worked. James's mom started seeing Brad in a more positive light, which only fueled his ego. But the real turning point was when Stephanie started planning her wedding with Brad. Yep, you heard that right. They got engaged. And it wasn't a normal, happy announcement. It was the most Brad and Stephanie thing you could imagine. They posted a photo of her hand with the ring, captioned, "When you know, and tagged it with hashtags like Jacharine, Power Couple, and Chachar Better Than Fairy Tales. It was so over the top that James and I couldn't stop laughing. Of course, we found out later that Brad had proposed right after James told the family he was planning to propose to me. It was no coincidence. Brad couldn't stand the idea of James being in the spotlight, so he had to make his move first. And Stephanie? She probably loved the drama of it all. What really rubbed salt in the wound was how they acted afterward. When James proposed to me, we were over the moon. But as soon as we shared the news with his family, Brad and Stephanie made it about them. Stephanie kept saying things like, "Oh my gosh, maybe we'll all get married in the same year. That would be so fun." And Brad, with his usual smugness, said, "Guess we're just a family of overachievers, huh?" Stephanie's wedding planning became her entire personality. Every time we saw her, she'd find a way to bring it up, even if it wasn't relevant. If someone complimented my ring, she'd immediately start talking about her venue or her dress. And the worst part? She wasn't just showing off. She was subtly trying to undermine our plans. One time, she cornered me at a family dinner and said, "You're going to love wedding planning. It's so stressful but so worth it. Just make sure you don't let it take over your life." Oh, and I'd avoid pastel colors. They're so overdone. I hadn't even mentioned what colors I was considering. But guess what? I'd been leaning toward pastels. It was around this time that I started noticing how little Stephanie actually knew about Brad's past. She seemed completely unaware of his long list of exes and the drama he'd left behind. She talked about him like he was some kind of saint, saying things like, "Brad has such high standards. That's why he didn't settle down before me." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. High standards? The guy had dated half the county and cheated on most of them. Stephanie was living in a bubble, completely blind to who Brad really was. And honestly, I couldn't wait for that bubble to burst. If she wanted to be part of the Brad show, she'd have to deal with everything that came with it. Little did she know, her big debut was just around the corner, and it wasn't going to go the way she thought. Okay, so let's get into the good part. By now, you probably have a pretty good idea of how Brad and Stephanie operate. They're not just the type of people who crave attention. They're the kind who need to dominate every single moment, even if it means ruining someone else's. And when it came to our engagement, they weren't content with just stealing the spotlight. No, they wanted to sabotage us completely. It started at our engagement party. James and I had planned this small get-together with close friends and family to celebrate the big news. Nothing fancy, just some food, music, and good vibes. Of course, we invited Brad and Stephanie because, well, they're family, and we figured it'd look bad if we didn't. In hindsight, I wish we'd just forgotten to send their invite. When they arrived, it was clear they weren't there to celebrate us. Stephanie showed up in this glittery dress that screamed, "Look at me," and Brad had his usual smug grin plastered across his face. Within 5 minutes, they were already working the room, talking to everyone about their engagement. It was exhausting. At one point, I overheard Stephanie telling one of James's aunts, "We're so excited to get married before the end of the year. It's going to be the wedding of the century." She conveniently forgot to mention that their engagement had only happened after James proposed to me. The real drama started about halfway through the night. I'd gone into the laundry room to grab some extra napkins, and as I was walking back, I heard voices coming from the hallway near our guest bedroom. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I recognized Brad's voice, and, well, curiosity got me. I stopped in my tracks and listened. It was Brad and Stephanie, and they were whispering about our wedding. At first, I thought they were just gossiping or making snide remarks, which wouldn't have surprised me. But as I listened, I realized they weren't just talking trash. They were planning something. Brad was saying, "We need to make sure our wedding is the one everyone remembers. They think they're so perfect, but we'll show them who the real stars of this family are." Stephanie laughed and said, "Don't worry, babe. I've got a plan. We'll make her think we're on her side, like we're rooting for her. Then, when the wedding comes, we'll hit her where it hurts." I could feel my stomach twist as they kept talking. Their plan was bigger than I could have imagined. Stephanie wanted to get close to my bridesmaids, pretending to be friendly and helpful, only to stir up drama between them. She even said, "I'll make sure they're so busy fighting with each other, they won't even have time to focus on her." Brad chimed in with his own idea. He wanted to convince James's parents to pressure us into inviting more people to the wedding. People we didn't even know, just to throw off our guest list and create chaos. But the worst part? Stephanie had this grand finale planned. She wanted to give a surprise speech during the reception, pretending it was heartfelt, but actually using it to humiliate me in front of everyone. "I'll make her look like a total bridezilla," she said, laughing. "People will be talking about it for years." I stood there, frozen, as they went on and on. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't just trying to ruin our day. They were trying to tear us down completely. And the way they talked about it, like it was some kind of game, made my blood boil. Who does that? When they finally left the hallway, I slipped back into the party like nothing had happened. I didn't want to cause a scene, not yet anyway. I spent the rest of the night trying to act normal, but inside I was fuming. As soon as everyone left, I sat James down and told him everything. At first, he thought I was exaggerating. "Maybe they were just joking," he said, always trying to see the best in people. But when I repeated their exact words, his face went pale. "They're unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "Why can't they just leave us alone?" We spent hours talking about what to do. James wanted to confront them right away, but I stopped him. I knew Brad and Stephanie would deny everything and twist it around to make us look like the bad guys. That's their specialty, playing the victim. Instead, I suggested we let them think they were getting away with it. If they wanted to play dirty, we'd play smarter. We decided to act like we hadn't heard anything. James would keep his distance from Brad, and I'd be polite but distant with Stephanie. Meanwhile, I started making plans of my own. If they wanted to mess with our wedding, I'd make sure their wedding was the one nobody forgot, for all the wrong reasons. I started digging into Brad's past relationships. He had a long list of ex-girlfriends, and I figured some of them might still hold a grudge. It wasn't hard to find them. Social media made it easy. I reached out to a few, carefully explaining who I was and why I was contacting them. To my surprise, almost all of them were more than willing to talk. Turns out Brad had burned a lot of bridges, and these women were more than happy to help me expose him. One of them, Amy, told me about how Brad had cheated on her with 2 different women at the same time. "He made me feel like I was crazy for suspecting anything," she said. "I can't believe Stephanie is falling for his act." Another ex, Becca, laughed when I told her what I was planning. "Oh, I'm in," she said. "That guy deserves whatever's coming to him." Within a week, I'd assembled a small army of Brad's scorned exes. We created a group chat to coordinate everything. And let me tell you, these women were hilarious. The way they roasted Brad was better than any stand-up routine I'd ever seen. But we weren't just there to laugh. We had a mission. And when Brad and Stephanie's wedding day rolled around, we were ready. By the time their wedding invitations went out, I knew everything I needed to know. Stephanie was oblivious to Brad's history. She genuinely thought he was some kind of misunderstood prince. I almost felt bad for her. But then I remembered how she'd laughed about humiliating me at my own wedding. Whatever sympathy I might have had disappeared. Their wedding was set for a month before ours, and it was shaping up to be as over-the-top as you'd expect. They bragged about their fancy venue, their guest list, and how perfect everything was going to be. Stephanie even made a point of telling me how stressful planning a wedding was, as if I hadn't already started working on mine. "Don't worry, Kelly," she said with a fake smile. "I'm sure your wedding will be cute in its own way." I just smiled back, knowing she had no idea what was coming. Brad and Stephanie wanted to play dirty? Fine. But they were about to learn that messing with us was the biggest mistake they'd ever made. All right, so let me walk you through Brad and Stephanie's wedding day. Because not only was it the most satisfying train wreck I've ever witnessed, but I was there to see it all unfold. Their wedding was everything I hoped it would be. A total disaster, but one where they couldn't run away from the mess they'd created. James and I showed up, acting like the supportive family members we were supposed to be. I wore a simple dress, and James looked sharp in his suit. We didn't want to draw attention to ourselves, but I had a hard time keeping a straight face knowing what was about to go down. The venue was packed with people Brad and Stephanie had been bragging about inviting, colleagues, extended family, friends, and of course, Stephanie's parents' wealthy social circle. The place was decked out to the nines, Massive floral arrangements, glittering chandeliers, and the kind of over-the-top decor that screamed, "We spent too much money on this." Stephanie's dad had clearly bankrolled the entire thing, and Brad, predictably, was basking in the attention like he was some self-made mogul. James and I took our seats near the back, nodding and smiling politely to other guests while waiting for the show to start. The ceremony began with the usual grand entrance of the bridal party, and then Stephanie made her big appearance. Her dress sparkled so much it was borderline blinding, and she walked down the aisle with a smug smile, clearly loving every second of being the center of attention. Everything was going smoothly, well, for the first 10 minutes. The officiant welcomed everyone, and then Brad and Stephanie stood side by side, holding hands and beaming. That's when Amy made her move. Amy stood up from her seat near the back of the room, dressed in a sleek, elegant gown that wouldn't have been out of place in a bridal party. At first, the guests thought she was part of the ceremony, maybe someone bringing a reading or a blessing. But then she walked straight up to Brad and Stephanie, stopping right in front of them. "Brad," she said, her voice clear and steady, "before you make any promises today, I think everyone here deserves to know the kind of promises you've broken." You could hear a pin drop, Brad's face drained of all color, and Stephanie's brow furrowed as she tried to figure out what was going on. Before anyone could stop her, Amy pulled out an envelope and handed it to Brad. He hesitated, but Stephanie snatched it and tore it open, pulling out a series of handwritten letters. "What is this?" Stephanie snapped, flipping through the pages. "They're love letters," Amy explained, her voice calm but cutting. "Letters Brad wrote to me while we were dating. Oh, and to several other women, while he was also dating me." The crowd erupted into whispers. Stephanie's hands shook as she skimmed one of the letters, her eyes narrowing with every word. Brad tried to grab the envelope, but Amy held firm. "You might want to let her finish," she said with a cold smile. "It gets better." Becca, the second ex, stood up then, striding confidently down the aisle. She, too, was dressed impeccably, and she held an envelope of her own. "Hi, Stephanie," Becca said sweetly, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "I'm Becca. I dated Brad for about 6 months. During that time, he told me he was saving up for our future. Turns out he was just borrowing money from me to take another girl out on dates." Stephanie's jaw dropped. "Is this true?" she hissed at Brad. "How many of these are there?" Brad stammered. It's not what it looks like. They're lying." One by one, more of Brad's exes stood up, each carrying their own envelope. Lisa walked down the aisle next, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. She handed her envelope to Stephanie, who was now visibly shaking. "You don't know me," Lisa said, "but I know Brad all too well. He promised me the world while he was sneaking off to see other women. Here's a list of their names. He gave them cute little nicknames in his phone so I wouldn't figure it out." At this point, the officiant looked completely lost, and the guests were openly gossiping. Phones were out, capturing every second of the chaos. Stephanie's parents looked horrified, whispering furiously to each other, while Brad's parents sat frozen, staring at their son as if seeing him for the first time. Danielle was the last to stand up. She didn't have an envelope, but carried a single sheet of paper. "This one's my favorite," she said, holding up what turned out to be a printed screenshot of a dating app conversation. "This is Brad matching with me on Tinder while he was already living with one of his exes. Recognize this, Brad?" The crowd gasped. Stephanie threw the envelopes onto the floor, her face red with fury. "How could you?" she spat at Brad. "Are these women lying? Or is this just a giant coincidence?" Brad looked like a deer caught in headlights. "I can explain," he stammered. "They're all just jealous. They're trying to ruin my life." "Oh, please," Amy snapped. "You ruined your own life, Brad. We're just here to make sure no one else gets hurt." Despite the chaos, Stephanie didn't storm off. No, she stood there, fuming, glaring at Brad like she wanted to murder him. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "We'll deal with this later. Let's just finish the ceremony." The officiant awkwardly cleared his throat and tried to regain control of the room. Shall we continue?" he asked, glancing nervously at the bride and groom. Brad nodded weakly, while Stephanie forced a tight-lipped smile. The guests were still whispering, and a few even left, clearly too uncomfortable to stick around. But the ceremony limped on, the vows rushed and robotic, and the atmosphere completely ruined. When it was finally over, the reception began, but no one cared about the couple anymore. The gossip was all about Brad's past. Every table was buzzing with conversation about the exes, the letters, and the lies. People kept glancing at Brad and Stephanie, who were doing their best to act like everything was fine. It wasn't. James and I stayed just long enough to enjoy the awkwardness before quietly slipping out. On the way home, we laughed until our sides hurt. Brad and Stephanie had wanted their wedding to be unforgettable, and in a way, they got their wish, just not the way they'd planned. After Brad and Stephanie's wedding disaster, you'd think they'd crawl into a hole and try to lay low for a while. But nope, they came out swinging, desperate to figure out how their perfect day had turned into a complete circus. I mean, I'll give them credit. They didn't pack up and leave town out of embarrassment. But honestly, maybe they should have. The first few days after the wedding were pretty quiet on our end. James and I carried on as usual, trying not to laugh every time we thought about what had happened. We didn't hear a peep from Brad or Stephanie, but the group chats were buzzing. Apparently, everyone in their social circle was talking about the exes, the letters, and the sheer audacity of the whole thing. Stephanie's parents were furious, not at Brad, which they should have been, but at the humiliation they felt in front of their fancy friends. By midweek, the silence broke. Stephanie started posting vague, passive-aggressive comments on social media about fake people and how she'd never let anyone ruin her happiness. Brad, on the other hand, wasn't subtle at all. He posted a whole rant about how some jealous, bitter women had tried to sabotage him and Stephanie, but failed because love always wins. The comment section was a mix of people supporting him, mainly his clueless friends, and others hinting that maybe he wasn't as innocent as he claimed. James and I kept our heads down, liking a few generic posts here and there to avoid suspicion. But then, Brad and Stephanie started sniffing around. It started with a random call from Brad. James answered it while we were making dinner, putting the phone on speaker. So, Brad started awkwardly, "How'd you guys enjoy the wedding?" James gave me a look but played it cool. "It was nice," he said. "The venue was beautiful." "Yeah, thanks," Brad replied, his tone shifting. "So, you guys didn't notice anything weird? Like during the ceremony?" "Weird? No, why?" James asked, perfectly innocent. "Oh, nothing," Brad said quickly. "Just thought you might have heard some rumors or something. You know, people can be jealous." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Brad was fishing, and James wasn't taking the bait. "I didn't hear anything," James said casually. "Everything seemed fine to me." Brad let out a forced laugh. Yeah, that's what I thought. Anyway, see you around." He hung up, and James and I burst out laughing. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few days, Brad and Stephanie started asking other family members if they knew anything about the exes showing up. Word got back to us that they were convinced someone had orchestrated it, but had no idea who. Stephanie apparently suspected one of her bridesmaids, but Brad had his sights set on James and me. "They think we did it," I told James one night after his sister Emma called to update us. "Let them think it," James said, smirking. "They can't prove anything." For a while, it felt like we were in the clear. That is, until James's parents called and asked us to come over for dinner. Now, let me tell you something about James's parents. They've always tried to stay neutral when it comes to Brad and James's sibling drama, but I could tell from the moment we walked into their house that they were gearing up for a serious conversation. Dinner was tense. Normally, his mom would be chatting about her garden or their latest Netflix obsession, but she barely said a word. His dad was equally quiet, which is rare for him. After dinner, his mom cleared her throat and said, "So, we've been hearing some things about Brad's wedding." James played dumb. "Oh? What kind of things?" She sighed. "Brad and Stephanie are saying someone might have had something to do with what happened during the ceremony. They think it was you two." I felt James tense next to me, but I decided to take the lead. "Why would they think that?" I asked, keeping my tone light. His dad frowned. "Well, you have to admit, it's a little suspicious. Those women showing up, it's not something that just happens, and you've never exactly gotten along with Brad." James exhaled and leaned forward. "All right, fine, it was us." His mom gasped, and his dad just stared at him, his jaw tightening. "You're serious?" his dad asked. "Yes," I said. "We planned it. But before you get mad, you need to know why." We explained everything. How I'd overheard Brad and Stephanie plotting to humiliate us at our wedding, how they wanted to ruin my relationships with my bridesmaids, and make a spectacle out of us during our reception. I told them about the awful things they said, how they laughed about it like it was some big joke, and how I knew we had to stop them before they got the chance. James chimed in saying, "We didn't want to do this, but they left us no choice. They've been trying to one-up us and tear us down for years. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting our day." His mom looked horrified, not at us, but at the idea that Brad and Stephanie would do something so cruel. "Are you sure they were really planning all that?" she asked. "I heard them say it," I said firmly. "Every word. They didn't care about how it would hurt us. They just wanted to make our wedding a joke." His dad rubbed his temples, clearly trying to process everything. "You shouldn't have stooped to their level," he finally said. "But I can't say I blame you." His mom nodded slowly. "It's hard to hear, but if what you're saying is true, I understand why you did it. I just wish things hadn't come to this." The conversation ended on a tense but understanding note. They didn't condone what we did, but they couldn't deny that Brad and Stephanie had pushed us to the edge. We left their house feeling a little lighter, knowing they weren't going to defend Brad this time. Over the next few days, things settled down. Brad and Stephanie were still sniffing around for answers, but James's parents didn't give them any hints. Emma called us to say their mom had pulled Brad aside and told him to stop harassing the family about the wedding. Apparently, Brad had the nerve to act offended, saying he was the victim, but she shut him down pretty quickly. As for Stephanie, she started posting less and less on social media, and when she did, it was all overly cheerful, like she was trying to prove how happy she was. But the cracks were starting to show. A mutual friend told us she'd been complaining to anyone who'd listen about how someone ruined her big day and how unfair it was. Meanwhile, her parents were pressuring Brad to fix things because they didn't want their family name dragged through the mud. James and I, on the other hand, were focused on our wedding. With Brad and Stephanie's chaos behind us, we could finally enjoy the planning process. We kept everything low-key and intimate, making sure only the people we trusted were involved. And the best part? We didn't have to worry about Brad and Stephanie showing up. But of course, this wouldn't be the last time they tried to insert themselves into our lives. They had one last trick up their sleeve, and while it didn't go the way they planned, it made for an unforgettable finale. It started with an odd phone call. James got a message from an old coworker he hadn't spoken to in years, congratulating him on the wedding and saying, "I'm looking forward to seeing you both there." Confused, James called him back and asked how he knew about the wedding. Turns out, Brad and Stephanie had somehow gotten hold of our guest list and venue details and sent out fake invitations under other people's names. At first, we didn't even believe it. Who does that? But when a couple of other guests mentioned they'd received duplicate RSVPs with slightly different details, we knew Brad and Stephanie were behind it. Their plan was obvious: sneak in under fake names, cause a scene, and ruin our day. Thankfully, we were prepared. After Brad and Stephanie's wedding fiasco, we decided to take every precaution to keep them out of ours. We'd hired security for the venue, and every guest was required to check in with ID at the door. It felt a little extreme at first, but now we were grateful we'd gone the extra mile. On the day of the wedding, everything started off perfectly. James and I were both excited and nervous in that giddy pre-wedding way. Guests began arriving, and security was doing an amazing job keeping things organized. It was shaping up to be the best day of our lives. And then they showed up. I didn't see it happen myself, but I heard about it from our wedding planner, who came rushing over to me with wide eyes. "We have a situation at the entrance," she said. "There's a couple trying to get in, claiming to be family." My stomach dropped. "Is it Brad and Stephanie?" I asked. She nodded. James and I had already agreed to let security handle them, so I told her to stick to the plan. "Just make sure they don't get in," I said. "We're not dealing with them today." Meanwhile, at the entrance, Brad was putting on his best performance. Dressed in a sharp suit, he was trying to convince the security team that he was James's brother and had every right to be there. "This is family business," he argued, his voice growing louder with every word. "You can't keep me out of my own brother's wedding." Stephanie stood next to him in a sleek dress, arms crossed and looking furious. "We're on the guest list," she snapped. "This is ridiculous." The head of security, a no-nonsense guy we'd hired specifically for situations like this, didn't budge. "Your names aren't on the list," he said firmly, "and without an invitation or proper identification, I can't let you in." Brad's face turned red, and he launched into a rant about how family doesn't need an invitation. Stephanie, meanwhile, completely lost her cool. "This isn't over!" she screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the security guard. "You'll regret this." The guard calmly escorted them back to their car, ignoring their threats and protests. By the time they finally drove off, half the guests were already inside, oblivious to the drama unfolding outside. The rest of the day was perfect. I mean, absolutely perfect. Once James and I were standing at the altar, nothing else mattered. Surrounded by friends and family who genuinely loved and supported us, we celebrated our relationship and the life we were building together. The ceremony was beautiful, emotional, and exactly what we'd dreamed of. A few days after the wedding, word started getting around about what had happened at the entrance. Some guests had seen Brad and Stephanie being turned away and had no problem sharing the details. The story spread fast, and people were eating it up. Apparently, Brad and Stephanie had been ranting to anyone who would listen about how unfair it was that they weren't allowed in. But instead of getting sympathy, they just made themselves look even more pathetic. It didn't take long for the cracks in their relationship to show. Stephanie, who had always prided herself on appearances, was mortified by how they'd been humiliated. Twice now. About a month after the wedding, we heard from a mutual friend that Stephanie had finally had enough. She'd dug a little deeper into Brad's past and found out just how much he'd lied to her about his finances, his relationships, and even his role in their own wedding planning. Apparently, she confronted him in a spectacular blowout fight, packed her things, and left him. From what we heard, Brad was devastated, or as devastated as someone like him could be. He tried calling her, messaging her, even showing up at her parents' house, but she was done. For the first time in his life, Brad was facing the consequences of his action, and there was no one left to clean up his mess. As for James and me, we're happier than ever. Our wedding was everything we'd hoped for, and we've spent the months since enjoying married life without Brad and Stephanie's drama weighing us down. Cutting them out of our lives was the best decision we ever made. They tried to ruin our happiness, but all they did was destroy their own. Sometimes poetic justice isn't just satisfying, it's absolutely necessary.